amplify in 2037 or whatever we do the next one. It's ones that would not have occurred because they were not as relevant. Anyway, cyber physical was a little bit relevant, but the other two are brand new. Yeah, but it's, it's much more widespread than it was. The first one now has to do with the speed and scale of distribution of information and the production of it, which was not, nothing like that in even 10 years ago. So Paul England, my friend, will take us through this.
Thank you, John. I assume the microphone is on. So yeah, now for something completely different. We're talking in this session about information provenance and the problems that arise when we do not have very good information provenance in an ecosystem where it's also very easy to generate high quality fake information. My co-panelists here are Hany Farid from the University of California at Berkeley and John Collomosse from Surrey and Adobe Research. They are both virtual. I imagine at some point we'll see a big picture. Yes, I see Hany has shown up there. That's great. I'm going to let them introduce themselves as they make their opening statement, but I just wanted to give you their names now. So this is the description of the cyber hard problem as taken from the report. So I'll just read it for you. And then I have one slide where I'm going to go through what I think are the what's going on to make this into the problem that it is today. And you can, as I'm going through that information, you can think about where information provenance might help in solve this problem. And if you want to turn that into a set of questions at the end, that would be great too. But let me just read this to you. So CHP 7 is information provenance, and it says digital platforms and AI generated content have transformed how people generate, receive, and share information, and have also opened new channels for misinformation, manipulation, and deception. These risks can erode trust in institutions, public discourse, and cybersecurity itself. And this is my one slide, which I'm going to talk to around what I think the technological and semi-technological things that are going on to make this into a problem now. I'm going to start at the top with generative AI. And generative AI gets all the press today, but I hope to convince you by going through the rest of the bullets here that there's more going on than just that. So we've all seen and been astonished and impressed by how good these generative AI tools are today. Multimodal generative AI can generate content for fun or for ill that is pretty much indistinguishable for most people. Most times it's indistinguishable from reality, the sort of thing you would get from a human if they typed it into a word processor or a camera or anything like that. Now, of course, the ability to generate fakes is not new, right? People have been doing forgeries for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. But up until the sort of generative AI boom that we're seeing today, this was a relatively time-consuming process that involved really needed experts. So, somebody sitting down with Adobe Photoshop, I'm not sure how many people in the room could do a good job making something sort of compelling and misleading using Photoshop. I certainly couldn't, and if I were to try, it would take me hours or a day to do a good job. These generative AI tools, both wrapped up behind cloud services and bundled into apps and in stuff you can download from the web, have very much democratized that. So now anybody can, at any time, generate content that is pretty much indistinguishable from reality from the perspective of most people. So it's also relatively cheap. So previously, if you were spending a day generating a bit of misinformation, you would probably use that in a broadcast setting, right? I mean, certainly you could sort of do phishing, targeted phishing to certain high importance individuals. But if it takes that much time and that much effort to generate misinformation, then you really want to broadcast it to a large number of people. Another thing that these generative AI tools have proven to us and astonished us by is how well they could sort of personalize. So these things can now start to be used in a more sort of conversational setting and in a more one-on-one setting. So scale and targeting and democratization is sort of new behind the generation of misinformation. So that's the generation part. There's obviously more going on than just generative AI, but generative AI is certainly one of the things that makes it a cyber hard problem right now. But I want to talk more about how things are distributed and how they're received. So one of the problems we have with distribution is it's relatively easy to be anonymous in most settings. Of course, the cartoon is on the internet. No one knows you're a dog, but this shows up in a number of places, right? So we're on a Zoom call right now. We can see Hany. We can see John. Are they really Hany and John? You know, we do not have a strong authenticated connection between us. We just have a link that they clicked on. So the sorts of puppeteering, generative AI tools could be used for ill in any number of settings. A sort of special class of anonymity, which certainly is important, I think, in the promotion of misinformation on the internet at scale, is bots. If you have good anonymity, or if you don't have a strong identity layer on the internet, then it's very easy for bots to appear to be people, appear to be corporations, appear to be first-class members of this ecosystem. So it's very hard to get good numbers, but we're certainly seeing that, at least on some of the social media networks, percents to tens of percents of the accounts on those platforms are bots. And arguably, if there's a real person behind a somebody generating, say, libelous content, then we have some legal recourse to get after those people if they're doing something that breaks the law. If it's a bot, it's sort of 2 or 3 steps removed to finding out who the person is, and we're not even sure whether the laws that we have today really apply to misinformation generated by a bot. Next thing to talk about is peer-to-peer. So in the sort of news ecosystem, which is certainly one part, not the whole part, but one part of this problem, we up until a few years ago, most people, most of the time, got their news information through broadcast sources. So this was a relatively few, typically larger corporations and public figures that were generating content, and everybody watched the same stuff. And although none of us, I'm sure in this room, would say that the legacy media, if you like, is a perfect thing, we sort of understood it well, right? There were brand protection that these corporations wanted to maintain, and libel laws to stop them from doing something bad. And now if you look at the numbers, I don't have them with me. I should look this up. Young people right now get most of their news information through social media sources, and many of them through sharing through friend networks. So we've gone from this sort of broadcast mechanism for information to something which is much more distributed and peer-to-peer. Next thing to say, and this again mostly applies to social media platforms, is that what we see on the internet is designed to at least first order to make money for the social media platforms. So this means that they measure engagement, and they feed you stuff that causes you to engage with the content, share it, spend time looking at it, and of course, because of our human frailties, it turns out that we like pictures of kittens, we like pictures of dogs, but we also like pictures. We like content that enrages us, right? People get excited in a bad way because of things that enrage them, and they tend to interact with that more and share that more. So what this sort of means is that the social media platforms sort of have a dial they can turn, which is what you see. And that may not always be good for the individual, cyberbullying, for instance, and it may not be good for society. Next thing to talk about is, and this gets a little bit to anonymity and bots. Every society strikes a balance between free speech and sort of libel and damage that can be caused through people telling lies. As we know, the US favors free speech, and I think this served us well as society. Different societies make different trade-offs in this regard. But one thing that's certainly true is on the internet right today, with the anonymity and with the amount of information that's flowing, there's really very little sort of legal backstops towards sharing damaging, libelous information. And so this sort of what has historically been brakes on the damage that can be caused through misinformation flows are sort of not there any longer. The last one I want to talk about, in briefly at least, is Section 230. So Section 230 is commonly used shorthand for a section in the Communications Decency Act, which got to legal liability for platforms like social media networks. So historically and embodied in law, someone like the Postal Service does not bear any responsibility for crimes that are communicated using that postal service, right? If I commit fraud by posting a letter, or if I commit fraud using the telephone, then those carriers are not held legally responsible for any harm that might be caused. Section 230 wrote into law that should also be true for the internet services we use today. I should say this has been broadly and widely believed to be one of the key reasons why we have the wonderful internet that we have today. So this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that the social media companies, if harm is happening on their networks, they do not have much liability for that. So that's my introduction to the sort of scope of the problem we're talking about here. As I said before, if we were to fix any one of these problems, or if we were to provide a better provenance ecosystem, then not all problems would be solved by this, but I think it's interesting to think about where we can start to make progress. And with that, I would like to hand it over to, maybe we'll start with Hany, because he's top on the screen right now, to introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and maybe your take on anything I left out, or your take on the problem. And then after that, we'll go to some questions.
Good. And I won't speak long because, Paul, you did a really nice job of sort of setting the landscape. I will point out, however, that you should have serious questions as to whether this is me or not. Because by just flipping a switch, I can change my identity. And I can switch back anytime I want, and I can switch between faces. And you can do this. This is nothing fancy. This is just a laptop, a 2-year-old laptop, and I can change my face in real time. And not only can I change my face in real time, it's incredibly good. So you can see I can occlude my face. I can push my face. Here's my favorite part. I'm going to show you my flashlight, and you'll see that it actually respects the lighting as well. So this is what's called a real-time face swap deepfake, eyebrow to chin, cheek to cheek, and I'm doing this in real time, and you have no idea who you're talking to at this point anymore. By way of background, sorry, I'm going to change my identity back. This is probably me. It's all getting pretty weird now. John knows me pretty well, so he can probably attest to it. So I'm an academic. I'm here at UC Berkeley in computer science and School of Information. I have been thinking about this problem for about 25 years, almost, and when we were still doing analog. And I started thinking about how you can authenticate content, particularly as it pertains to courts of law. Excuse me, we all saw the digital revolution coming. We didn't know where it was going or where it would lead, and nobody saw this, certainly. And for 25 years, we've been thinking about what happens when film can be manipulated, and then it was Photoshop, and now it was AI. And Paul, you said it really well, which is the issue we are seeing now is a full democratization of access to very sophisticated technologies that can whole cloth create realities in the form of images, audio, and video. We have the mechanism, as you very nicely put it, to distribute those to the world instantaneously with little to no content moderation. And then also, as you said, we have people who are engaging with, I wouldn't call it news, I would call it information, if you will, generously, as a primary source. And now you are talking about not a bespoke academic field dealing with courts of law. You are talking about existential threats. How do we reason about global climate change? How do we reason about a global deadly virus? How do we have trusted democracies? How do you respond to world events halfway around the world when everything that you are seeing around us can and may be manipulated? And I don't think this is hyperbolic, that if we don't have a shared sense of reality, I don't know how we move forward. And because I've been in this space for so long, I have seen this escalation, and this latest AI craze, particularly of the last few years, has really been dramatic, exciting in some ways and dramatic in others. And I think we have to get out ahead of it before it gets away from us. And the only thing I would disagree with you, Paul, is you said the wonderful internet we had. I'm not so sure it's a wonderful internet anymore. This is certainly not the internet that I signed up for, and I take some issues with how toxic and awful certain aspects of it are. And I'll turn it over to John.
Yeah, thanks, Hany. Yeah, I'm pleased to be at this event. I want to just make a few words of introduction. I think there's already been some fantastic intros given. I'm John Collomosse. I'm a professor here at the University of Surrey, where we lead a national research centre called Decade, which is a centre for the decentralised digital economy. And what's really meant by that decentralized digital economy is it's really what Paul alluded to in his introduction. It's that peer-to-peer distributed society we all live in today, where anyone can be a producer or consumer of digital assets or services. And of course, creative economy is a great example of this decentralization. We're trending away, we have been for some time, from like monolithic content providers we might have institutional trust in, into this sort of peer-to-peer model where everyone's a creator and consumer of media. And in the introduction there was mention of speed and scale. Well, this is no more so really in the case of news media. That means the provenance of that media is really, really important. Like who made it, how, from what sources, and especially as has been put very well already, due to the democratization of these digital manipulation technologies, which started a long time ago, but definitely have been accelerated and diversified as a threat with Gen AI. So in Decade, we see this as a digital supply chain problem. In fact, C2PA, which is an open standard for provenance that I and many others in the industry are involved in, sometimes refers to media provenance as like a sort of digital nutrition label, which I really like because it's a good analogy to, the food you find in the supermarket. We all want to know that Farmer Giles grew the coffee and paid his workers well and didn't use chemicals, and ultimately we're going to consume that food on that trust decision. News media is just as important. We need to know the provenance of our media. There's a lot of people making great detectors out there to try and thwart the kind of effects there that Hany, and he really is Hany, I'm sure, did in his introduction. But actually, it's not just about detection. It's about being able to make contextual trust judgments on content that you receive, based on who made it, how, and so on. And this is why provenance is so important. And I just end by saying it's not just about mis and disinformation. Actually, it's also about unlocking new capabilities. So if you trace content back to its owner and you establish it's authentic, then you say something about the value of that content. And there's use cases there beyond the security of the news and trust in the news, to things like copyright and AI, and ensuring consent and compensation for the reuse of media in any form, in Gen AI as well. So this is a really exciting problem to be talking about today, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Hany. So I have a few questions here, and just like the other speakers have done, I will ask those questions, and then I'll open it up to the room. So my first question, I guess, John first, and then Hany, and that is, can you provide some concrete examples where the lack of information provenance has caused harm? And please be sort of broad here. I mean, I think, news is always in the back of our mind, but if there are other examples, I mean, I think Hany has demonstrated one, possible example in his introduction, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm certain that Hany's going to talk about mis and disinformation here. So, I'm going to say something a little bit different, which is maybe pick up on my closing example from the intro. And that is about the reuse of media generally online, right? Creatives, they publish content online. They want to be discovered. They want to make, create exposure for themselves. But we've seen, people, particularly in the context of generative AI training, using that content, training models without regard to, in many cases, the consent of those creators, or even thinking about, possibly like licensing or compensating those creators. So I would say there's an example of sort of harm here, in the case of like economic harm and reputational harm, actually, to the creative sector, because if we had better provenance information integrated into our information infrastructure, we could figure out who owns this content, and we could figure out if they give permission, and we could pay them or generate value for them in other ways. It doesn't have to be financial, and this would be a great way to mitigate the harm that we're seeing in some cases to the creative sector. So I'd like to go with that as the example, Hany.
Yeah, so mis and disinformation is easy. We know this. 1 in 5 Americans believe that Bill Gates created COVID to put a tracking device, and that maps with people who are not getting vaccinated. This is coming from disinformation campaigns, whether they're AI powered or not. So that's the easy one. Let me talk about ones that are maybe less obvious. So one is on the creation of child sexual abuse material, where people are taking the likeness of a child, inserting it into explicit material, sending it to the child, and saying, if you don't take photos of yourself, I'm going to distribute this. The child is then extorted, they create images of themselves, and now they're in this vicious loop. And we have seen cases, this is not hypothetical, where kids will take their own lives. And this doesn't unfold over days or weeks or months, it unfolds in minutes. Awful, awful things happening to children. The creation of non-consensual intimate imagery, where primarily women's likenesses are being inserted into explicit material and then weaponized against them. And it's not just the Taylor Swifts of the world, and I'm not excusing that, please understand. It is journalists, it's politicians, it's teachers, it's lawyers, it's people who just attract unwanted attention. Lives are being destroyed. We are seeing small scale and large scale fraud. If your child has 15 seconds of audio on a TikTok video, I can clone their voice. And then because of all the data breaches, I know who your parents are. I know what their phone number is. I call them and say, in your child's voice, your child has been taken, send $8,000 or I'm going to kill them. That's not hypothetical, it's happening. Large scale fraud. We've seen many, many cases where tens of millions of dollars are being taken from enterprises. And by the way, for every one of those that you've read in the newspaper, know that there's a dozen that you are not reading about because people are not publicizing it. And here's the last one, which is what's called the liar's dividend, which is that when we enter this world where anything can be manipulated, any image, any video, any audio, we can deny uncomfortable realities. A video of a politician saying something offensive, fake. A video of human rights violations, fake. A video of police brutality, fake. What are we going to believe anymore? How do we reason about a complex world when things can be fake and we can suddenly say anything that is inconvenient to us, fake? And that's not a hypothetical, by the way. This is already happening among politicians on a daily basis.
Thank you. Next question is trying to tell real from fake a reasonable approach to mitigating harm from misinformation? And then in parentheses I have, and what exactly is real and fake anyway? And I think that was demonstrated quite nicely by Hany in his opening remarks. But over to you, John.
Yeah, I think it's definitely vital that people are empowered to discriminate real from fake content, but it's important that they ultimately make their own trust decisions and don't rely exclusively upon technology to do that. Right. So, as I was sort of saying earlier, users need to make these contextual trust judgments. We need to provide users with information and the, digital literacy and education to make sense of that information so that they can, knowing where content has come from and where it's been made, that they can make their own trust decisions on that content. So, yeah, it's absolutely vital. If you look at, some of the adoption, some of these open provenance standards, now you see like high-end cameras starting to put, in their firmware standards like CTPA to record provenance information. The reason, that's happening is that journalists clearly value, the ability to prove the authenticity of their work, exactly so people can tell real from fake. I think, we should go a lot further, frankly. I mean, if you look at the scientific literature, one of the really sad things, one of the many sad things that has come out of generative AI in that area has been the fabrication of scientific imaging from microscopes, particularly in the cancer research domain. And, if you can put provenance in the firmware of a camera, surely you can do so in a, $500,000 microscope or multi-million-dollar probably microscope. So, I feel like telling real from fake is not only something we need to drive in the news domain, but more generally in any form of digital media, so that people can, sort of reestablish trust in that media.
So I would say context matters here a great deal. So when it comes to fraud, I think this is saying this is an authentic video of Hany or not is really good. That sort of gets you where you want to. I think when it comes to things like non-consensual intimate imagery and child sexual abuse, I don't think that gets you where you want to. And certainly not for mis and disinformation. I think it's necessary, but insufficient. And here's why. Understand that the half-life of a social media post is measured in 90 seconds. So I will tell you, I'm here on the West Coast. I get up typically 6:30 in the morning. By the time I'm awake, I've got a dozen calls from reporters almost every single day. And by the time I put an eyes on a piece of content, it's got 10 million views. I'm a post-mortem at best, right? And it's important. We should fact check and we should set the record straight. But does that deal with the problem? No. And now I'm going to get to John's point too, is we should put labels on content. We should say this is real. This is, I would say, a natural recording versus AI generated. Now this gets to your question, Paul, what is real anywhere? But putting the equivalent of nutrition label is great. But you and I both know that that doesn't get us where we want to in a highly, highly polarized society, right? Where people want to believe what they believe. And so I think it's necessary, but I don't think it's sufficient. And I think we need real leadership top down, and we need good conversations like this one to educate the public.
Thank you. So we've touched on this, but I'll ask the question and you can sort of fill in anything you don't feel like you've said adequately so far. And the question is, what are the most promising technological or non-technological approaches to improving information provenance? In what settings do they work well and where do they fall short? Is more research funding needed, or is this being handled adequately by the private sector?
Well, is that to me? I can maybe go first. I think, the challenge around provenance is that our current infrastructure, wasn't built with content integrity in mind, and retrofitting provenance into the ecosystem is really hard. So open standards are a great step forward there. But there are many, technical challenges that we need to overcome to capitalize on those initial steps. So, I mean, one technology I think that's very promising is like watermarking and fingerprinting technologies that help essentially perform content identification. And the typical use case for that in provenance is that if provenance information is stripped away as it's distributed through content platforms online, you can use watermarking or fingerprinting or essentially content ID technologies to go look up that missing provenance information from some kind of trusted database. So those technologies, they exist. There's definitely ways they can be improved. But I think the bigger question is, thinking about where that information is looked up from. There isn't a trusted database for the world's media. There probably shouldn't be a centralized trusted database for the world's media for all sorts of scalability, liability, privacy reasons. So, I think a really interesting technology is, decentralized technologies. Things like not just distributed ledgers, but ways that you can do like federated search in a privacy preserving way across large collections of, for example, provenance information. And this will allow people to, create durable solutions for provenance information that can be recovered using these kinds of technologies. So I would definitely say, more research is definitely needed around the scalability of decentralized technologies. And that is, really a really great direction to invest further research funding in, because it does require deep research. Perhaps the second one, if I may, is like maybe completely complementary, is around human factors research. So we can go through a lot of effort in persisting provenance information through content platforms, present it to the user, and this information is very technical and very rich. And we can start doing things like presenting it at different levels of detail in the user experience, but perhaps we can start thinking about other ways of ensuring people kind of comprehend in an intuitive way this information, can make those more informed trust decisions. And this might even involve things like co-pilots and chatbots and conversational agents that help people come to their own decision about the trustworthiness of a piece of content. So yeah, I think more to summarize, more research in decentralized platforms and technologies, and more research into design and human factors to help people make sense of this information.
Yeah. So, Paul, you should never ask an academic if we need more funding. The answer is yes, of course we do. I will say, particularly at this time, because the NSF the National Science Foundation has started pulling back on funding for deepfake research because it has been embroiled under the current administration with issues of disinformation, which I think is incredibly misguided. By the way, I was asking the chat to redo the video with my fake face, so now you can sort of see at full screen what this looks like. And you can see what that looks like when I'm, a completely different identity. Yeah. Now that I'm full screen.
Well, the short ones, Hany.
Sorry, Paul. Okay. Sorry, I missed that. So I'll add a couple. So first of all, I think John is 100% right. The most promising, and this is an important word, scalable solution today are the content credentials that are being worked at C2PA and the Content Authenticity Initiative. It's an amazing thing to watch over a period of 5 years, multiple stakeholders from the private sector to media outlets to academics working together for this. And I think we should all get behind this, and I think it's terrific. I'll add one more thing here, and you mentioned it early on, Paul, is Section 230 on the regulatory side. Section 230 made sense in the 1990s when the internet was not social media, was not algorithmic amplification, was not the attention-based economy. It was chat rooms. And it made sense to equate chat rooms with the phone line and the US Postal Service. But you can't equate Facebook and TikTok and YouTube and Twitter with that, right? So the way the social media companies want you to have it is say, well, we're just the wire. But they're not the wire, because when you go to Facebook, when you go to Twitter, when you go to TikTok, when you go to YouTube, when you go to Facebook, they are feeding you information, right? And slapping an ad on it and monetizing it. That is not what the founders of 230 had in mind. So we need to have some serious conversations. And I'm not suggesting we revoke 230, but we really should reconsider it. And on that front, the EU and the AI Safety Act, and some online safety bills in the UK, John's hometown, the Online Safety Act. There's some really thoughtful things, and in Australia, we are seeing some thoughtful regulation to rein in some of the worst abuses and hold the tech companies responsible for some of the harms that they either knew or should have known were happening. And I think when that happens, colliding with technology and education, I think we'll start to see forward motion.
Okay, one last question, then I'll open up to the room. And the question is, so we've, I don't know how long you've been on the call, but we've been talking about the Steve Lipner 2045 report. So these have been coming out about every 20 years. And do you think that this broad field of information provenance and misinformation will be on the 2045 report? Or do you think we'll have cracked it by then? I guess Hany first and then John.
God, I can't tell you what's going to happen in 45 days, let alone in the year 2045. I don't know. I was just reading a report. I don't mean to be flippant about this, but I'm going to buy some time to think of an answer. I was just reading a report from Anthropic that said that when their chatbot was pushed into a corner, it tried to kill an engineer that was installing software. Literally, it tried to lock doors in an oxygen-deprived space. So I'm not sure we're all going to be here in 20 years, but will we have cracked it? No. But like everything in cybersecurity, the hope is that it's manageable. Think spam, malware, viruses. Have we cracked it? Not really. The threats still exist, but they're mostly manageable. That's my hope. But at the trajectory we are going, I'm not sure we're going to get there.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a long-term problem that will be around certainly in another sort of 20, maybe another 50 years. I feel like the problem of disinformation, basically people lying to one another, has been around as long as the spoken word, and I don't think we're going to solve that problem. But we will probably be a long way along the line of improving our information infrastructure to communicate better trust signals about content. So, when we kicked off the Content Authenticity Initiative, it was about five or so years ago, sort of remember having a slide that said, no one will buy an image in 5 years' time unless it has provenance information, right? And I don't think that's come true, but I do think people care a lot more about the rights and origins of images. And I think it is probably the case very soon that people won't use an AI model unless they know the provenance of the data it's trained on, for all sorts of cybersecurity reasons, as well as rights and copyright reasons. So I think it will be around in 2045. I think it will be more foundational. I think, Gen AI will be, ubiquitous. There'll be a trust infrastructure that has to deal with that will be just as important as HTTPS is and the padlock is, in your browser, will be things like content credentials. I think essentially what I'm saying is that provenance is going to be, evolving from a feature in a product, which is kind of what it is now, to like basically a requirement that everyone has in their infrastructure. And that's how I see it evolving. But that doesn't mean we'll have solved the problem of people basically trying to deceive one another through information, which is, you know, just an age-old problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Questions from the room? For the people who don't have a microphone, if you could walk to a microphone so that our remote participants, and we'll go with you first.
Hi, my name is Tim Tang with Hughes. Thank you very much for this. This has been a very disturbing presentation on many different fronts. I think one of the challenges that is aggravating the issue is that when you think about the echo chamber effect, people actually want to be deceived and they want to hear what they want to hear. I think those some of the points that you made earlier, which makes it even harder. And then you have big tech companies that are making an awful lot of money with what they're doing today. And so that doesn't seem like it's going to change. My question is this, I was wondering if, based on what you understand and based on what you know, if you could offer some expectations with regards to milestones over the next, say, 6-12 months of what you think is going to happen. It seems like a lot of the solutions you've been discussing are things that would be nice to have or could have, or you hope we have, but the reality of it is that we probably won't. So what kind of milestones of problems do you expect to happen over the next, or would be reasonable to expect over the next, say, 6 to 12 months?
Hany, you were nodding there. Is something you want to say?
Yeah. So first of all, you're 100% right. I mean, we've been talking about technology and technology sector and regulators, but we've got to admit that the humans are part of the problem. They want to be lied to. They want to be deceived, and we're simply giving them what they want. I would say the original sin here is the business model of the modern internet, which is ads, right? It's attention economy. And when you have an attention economy, that's the way to go. I take some comfort in seeing this latest wave of technology, particularly AI, not being yet, hopefully, attention economy. You pay for these services. And when you pay for the service, it's a better business model because it's not give the user whatever it is that grabs their attention. So I take some comfort in that. I'm going to try to answer your question, but let me first say one thing we should not do. And one thing we should not do is pause any AI regulation as being proposed by the federal government for the next 10 years. That's insane. Are we out of our minds? So we should definitely not do that. Here's what I would like to see in the next 6 to 18 months is right now, if you go over to OpenAI and you generate an image with ChatGPT's image model, it will attach a content credential. And if you upload that image to LinkedIn, LinkedIn will respect that credential and put a little badge on it. There's a little CR in the upper left-hand corner. Phenomenal breakthrough. There is no reason why we cannot have this everywhere. Right? At this point, we have a proof of concept. Every generative AI model should be able to do this. Google right now, every single piece of content from their image, text, audio, or video has a watermark. I'm hoping there'll be eventually, John, credentials in there as well. There's no reason why all of the major platforms cannot attach these credentials. And there's no reason why the YouTubes, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the X's, the Facebooks, etc., can simply respect those. We're not telling you that it's good content or bad content. We're not saying it's right or wrong. We're simply putting an attrition label on it. And I think this would be a huge step. I can tell you just in the last week, as we have seen the escalation in the conflict in Israel and Iran, the amount of fake videos and images that are circulating are deeply troubling. And this would not be the scale of the problem if we had this end-to-end solution. And there's no technical barrier here. We simply are choosing not to do it at this point. So if you ask me in that short-term range, your 6 to 18 month, I think this is doable, and I think it'll take a nice bite out of the problem. Now, there's adversaries, right? There are bad people out there who will do, it's okay, it's fine. This is cybersecurity. Everything's a mitigation, and this will mitigate a lot of the problem.
John.
Well, yeah, Hany's definitely indicated something I would like to see and expect to see happening in the next 6 to 12 months, which is a greater adoption of content credentials. I think, he suggested that in the question suggested, there's a lot we're talking about that hasn't happened yet. Actually, there's a huge amount that's happened. We saw just last year, it was a significant year in terms of over 2 billion people around the world voting in public elections had a massive spotlight on this and misinformation, and you know, massive adoption actually of content credentials across many platforms. Yeah, Hany started to enumerate that. There are a lot of platforms out there now, including the social platforms actually, that do have publicly stated that they use C2PA, but they're not actually carrying through the content credentials. They're using C2PA to try and make a judgment on AI labeling. Now, we could suppose that might be because, you know, there was a sort of hope to counter fraud risk, I guess, in elections. But I mean, you know, frankly, my personal view is also it's due to legislation that was coming out, you know, or was expected to come out. You know, things like, for example, the EU AI Act, you know, has labeling, you know, requirement coming into force. I think it's June next year. I think there's a Californian legislation recently and so on. So, yeah, I think legislation actually is driving adoption, and I think what we're going to see very soon, yeah, especially in Europe, actually, I think because there's quite a lot of it coming through the books, is more legislation, not necessarily around online harms, but around things like copyright and AI, and that legislation is going to drive further adoption, which in turn will benefit the disinformation problem. So I would expect to see a lot of you know, acceleration in the adoption of content credentials. Already many people write them, not that many people read them yet, but yeah, absolutely no reason they can't. We've seen many people launching browser extensions to view them. It isn't a big step to have a browser show that, and I hope that will happen in the very near term. You know, that would be my wish. Yeah.
Okay, we're out of time, but I said to Steve that I'd let him ask a question. If it's a quick question that allows a quick answer, Steve, go ahead.
Well, I don't know how
Otherwise,
quick the
Russell,
answer will be,
you
but the
can
question's quick. In the US, at least, the Supreme Court has held that there's a First Amendment right to speak anonymously. Videos and photos of, for example, police misconduct with consequent fear of retribution and harassment are a very real thing. What do you do about this
Yeah.
if you want to authenticate all images?
Good. Let's separate authentication from provenance, right? Provenance says who, where, when. Authentication just says these are the pixels that were recorded. You can have both. In fact, if you look at the C2PA, and I feel like an idiot talking about this because John knows more about it than I do, it separates those two things. And users should be able to opt out of the provenance. There are serious privacy concerns and serious safety issues for people reporting on police brutality and human rights violations. But built into the standard, because we had people on those working groups who came from the human rights side, is an acknowledgement of that and a mechanism to protect people's personal identity.
Yeah, I would just reinforce that fact. I mean, content credentials as a standard, there's absolutely nothing in it actually in the core standard about identities. You know, that is actually an extension of the standard, is optional. And when you look at the spec, you know, there's actually no requirement to embed any particular provenance fact in the record. So it's certainly possible to, you know, be anonymous and still have provenance markers attesting to the authenticity of your content. And furthermore, there are features in these open standards like C2PA for redacting information. So if you had a photojournalist, you know, present their information to a news publisher, the news publisher could assess the authenticity, redact if there was identity information there, redact that information, and then go ahead and go publish it. So people have thought about these questions. And I mean, in terms of legislation as well, you know, it's definitely an interesting question whether there should always be provenance and things. I don't personally believe there should, but, you know, there might be arguments there around certain verticals, or, you know, the fact that if provenance is there, maybe it shouldn't be stripped. I mean,